Hello, everyone. This is Tracybrooker with the Creative Outcomes podcast, a podcast about homeschooling, unschooling, self-directed learning, alternative education, and how you can reach those creative outcomes. Today with me, I have very special guest, Jerry Mintz, who I feel is one of the founders of alternative education, and you'll probably disagree with me, but from my perspective, and at least for many people I spoke with, when they said, until I found Jerry Mintz and Arrow, my life changed. And those have been people's very words. So Jerry, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself. And I was telling Jerry before we started that there could be a whole podcast about Jerry and what he's done. And I will share that. It's on his Arrow podcast. It's called Starting Things. And I just listened to it. And I myself was completely blown away because there are so many things I didn't know that you have helped people with, et cetera. So if you really want to hear the in-depth story about Jerry Mintz, it's available. So, and my cat's going to join us today. Go ahead, Jerry.
If you want to hear our podcast, you go to our website, educationrevolution.org, and you go to resources, and it's the top one. So the most recent podcast, I think, is the second one down. It's funny in terms of the effect that you have on people's lives. Well, you never know. But I just put out a newsletter about the fact that I just had my birthday.
Yes.
Make donations to Arrow. All those have gone straight to Nepal, it turns out. But anyway, to help this orphanage we're trying to help survive. But what was amazing to me is I had two different people that wrote back to me from that who I met on trains.
Wow.
And one of them, 1995, it just changed the whole direction of her life in terms of education. She was studying education, but she just didn't get some of these things. And then there was another couple I met at another conference that wrote back to me. It was amazing. You never know. You just never know how you're affecting people. You just do what you do. That's it, you know.
Well, I know we said we were going to talk about this, but I have to ask you is, and I've listened, like I said, to that podcast. So I know you talked about your grandfather and this idea of, he would always say, what do you want to learn today? But there was a point, whether it was in your own experience of education, your own schooling, that you said, I'm going to do this. Can you like just remember when that was, like, I'm going to go into education and change this? Or
no, it was more evolutionary. I'd say maybe one turning point was because I always thought I was going to be going into science. And you saw on the podcast that I had done research back when I was a teenager in cancer at a local laboratory that had a program for teenage kids, and was involved in 1965 or so, 64, in the development of the very beginnings of using the immune system to attack cancer.
right.
This was so far ahead of its time that the guy who was running the laboratory was very controversial, Bernard Malamud. But I worked on some things connected to that back then. And these were, I think, the seeds which finally have blossomed, and now this can be the most powerful thing ever in terms of curing cancer, is to use the immune system to destroy the specific cells that they have. So that also back then, at the same time, I didn't mention this in the podcast, but I also worked on the development of the heart-lung machine.
Oh, wow.
When I was working at my uncle's laboratory.
I was a respiratory therapist for 13 years. So I know the evolution of that. I understand that. So, wow.
It was funny though. I was a teenager. They gave me a little room at Long Island Jewish Hospital, and it was just the way you imagine science should look. I had, blood coming into the centrifuge to say.
That's right.
and these scientists would look in the door and say, "What's happening in there?" Anyway,
Wow.
so that was early experiences, but I evolved. I think the key was when I took a class at Goddard College with Alan Walker called Community Laboratory. And what we did is we started using the community to organize things. And so I organized the amateur radio club and so on, and then continued to do the cancer research that I had started there at Goddard. And I think that was, again, with this 4-H club I was involved with. And so, and then when I left for my work term for 2 months, they continued the work. The oldest kid was 13, and they continued doing the research while I was gone. One of those kids became a doctor. And these are rural Vermont kids. This is a kid whose parents were immigrants and from Poland and stuff like that. So again, you don't know what influence you're going to have on people.
So do you think it was just this observation of, here are these young kids. Now, were they all, even though this was kind of this community center, were they going to regular school and then came to you?
Never going to regular school. This was just a 4-H club that I used to help me do this research. And then he decided later on, he'd done various things and he wanted to go back to this biological research we'd done, and eventually, as I say, became a doctor and a surgeon.
But there's this idea, though, of, I think, where you kind of looked and said, wait, there's school, right? Kind of compulsory education, rules, etc. And then there's this, we'll say, unconditioned atmosphere, environments. There was some place, some experience, could have been in that community that you had this awareness going, there's something different.
Well, I think the takeaway from this is that people can experience this idea, even if it's not their whole school, and say, hey, wait, that's the direction I should be going in. And I think that that's what I discovered along the way is that, for example, I had a table tennis club that ran as a democracy. And the kids ran everything. And it was inside of an authoritarian boys and girls club.
I love it.
And so what happened is afterwards, I remember one kid was he was graduating from high school and he came over, dropped in, and I said to him, well, did you get anything out of the club while you were there? And he said, if I hadn't experienced that process, the democracy, I never would have become my class president and so on, wouldn't be going to and all that. So you don't know how these experiences are going to play out.
Yeah. And it was just a table tennis club.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, one of the stories I like to tell from that time was I remember the kids decided there was a rule at that club that you could only eat in certain designated places. And one of the kids felt that was interfering with our meetings. And so they proposed that people could bring the pizza, which is what it was basically, into the meetings. And as long as everything was cleaned up well afterwards. So that passed. And then one day, I was waiting for this to happen someday. They were eating their pizza in there, and one of the staff members looked through the window and saw them eating in there, and the door flew open, and this guy said, "You can't eat in here." And the kid said, "We can too, we passed it."
I love it.
So he apologized and left. See,
wow.
they had this real sense of power
Yeah.
in that very limited situation.
Yeah. I just had a conversation with Carl Rust, and we were talking about unschooling schools,
Mm-hmm.
and which I didn't know was an organization until I met Carl.
Mm.
But we were talking about public education. I was a public ed teacher for years, and it's the little things like you said. So he's gonna go back. He was subbing, and they asked him if the kids actually asked for him to go back, and so I said, well, he goes, oh, I already said yes, I'm going. And he goes, I said, well, what do you think you'll do? And he said, I think first I'm going to let the kids establish the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's this whole idea of, right, which this is where I think is a great entry point into the two paradigms of education, but maybe it's the little things of saying here, yes, we're in a public school compulsory environment, but I can still take this concept of the students establishing the rules is just a game changer in itself. So
we didn't actually start at the beginning. So I'm the director of the Alternative Education Resource Organization. And what we do is we network learner-centered educational alternatives around the world. And so we have about 600 members and I don't know, 10,000 or so, 15,000 on our mailing list who actually have contacted us, who are involved with alternative education. And we put out a newsletter at least once a week. And we have a conference, a national conference, and then we help with an international conference and a couple of others in between. So we stay pretty busy that way. When the pandemic hit, we started doing various things, but one was having Sunday open chats. And that anybody could drop in, talk about whatever they wanted, and various things seemed to evolve from that, including, I think, unschooling school.
yeah, well,
Came out of that, one of the Sunday chat group. You know, we did various other things. There were book clubs that evolved from it and some other things. You know?
but I will share that is the power of Arrow and your conferences and even the in-person when you're meeting somebody. And being public school teacher myself is, you know, you have this awakening moment of what is this, right? And then the next thought is, how can I get this in my classroom? And then I feel like there's this other conversation of blockages, you know, like, but I can't do this or they won't let me do this. And I think your follow-up of, you know, yes, you can. And the simple way would be have the students help you, you know, do the rules.
Yeah, see, I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can do it. The key is, as I said, with the example I gave before, you don't have, it doesn't have to be a whole school. It can be a classroom. If the students experience that, they've experienced the process.
Yes.
That's key. Once they've experienced the process, they know things can be done in a different way.
It's a different way of listening.
By the way, you mentioned Sir Ken Robinson, who I remember somebody introduced me to him through email, and I had this dialogue with him and told him about the conference, asked him if he could come speak. Of course, you know, he would get $60,000 for speaking somewhere, you know.
Right.
But anyway, we weren't going to pay him. But so he knew that. But so he thought, well, I'll send him a video, you know. But I kept on being persistent, and I said, yes, but you need to interact with these people. You need to network with them. And when he came to the conference to speak, which he did,
right,
he said, if persistence is considered an important goal, Jerry Mintz is the top person in that direction. Because
yep, I remember.
Anyway.
And he came, and it was an incredible talk.
Yeah.
And in the irony, I think more inspirational, something many of us already were aware of, but it was almost like just having this alternate person who can speak with the rest of society. And yeah, giving the rest of us confirmation, I think. So we were talking about these two paradigms of education.
Well, I think this is the core of what we're talking about. And it's really basic. And these two paradigms are really different. So the paradigm that is being used in over 98% of the schools around the world, I'd say, is the kids are naturally lazy and need to be forced to learn. And that we have the answers and we need to tell them what the answers are and they need to memorize them and then they'll be set for life. Well, there may have been a time in the past when that would work, but it's certainly not true now with the rate at which the world is changing. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, what would you have said to students about the internet or about podcasts or,
Yeah.
these things just didn't exist, you see, iPhones even. So our paradigm is that children are natural learners, that people are natural learners. If you accept that paradigm, then you can't do, or you should not do, a lot of things that are just routine in regular public schools, like homework.
That's correct.
Or not public schools, all schools really, because homework assumes that students wouldn't happen upon these things themselves, that you must force them to do it, and then so on. And well, it turns out to be that it is actually destructive of the natural ability to learn.
Counterproductive. Yep.
The more you force children to learn things that they're not interested in, the more you tend to kill the natural ability to learn, or extinguish it, as they say in psychology, and to the point where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So by the time children get to be 7th grade, 8th grade.
Yes, I think there was a study I found. They said by 7th grade, they found that the sense of creativity has diminished. And that was probably, I think that research was done probably 10 years ago, if not more. So
by then, they start to believe that they're not natural learners and that they need to follow the teacher. And it's a process of programming, you see. So that's something. It's interesting. We who have been through the regular system have kind of bought this, whether we realize it or not. And so we have to continuously deprogram ourselves and fight against this.
Yeah.
And for a good example is I've demonstrated democratic process all over the world. And I had just come back from India where I was demonstrating democratic process for the DAV, which is a big private school organization over there, at a school with 2,600 students.
Wow.
And what I did is I broke it down to smaller units and demonstrated democratic process with them. And eventually the students would go back to their homerooms and do little democratic meetings in their rooms, bring the results to a meeting. And so it wasn't exactly a parliament. It was actually everybody being able to be involved in the process. But so I came back from there and I was asked to go to visit, to teach, demonstrate democratic process at a school in New Jersey that we had helped to start. We have a school starters course. We're just finishing up the 17th one. And we've started over 100 schools in that process. And so they asked me to go over to New Jersey, but I realized as I was driving over there, the oldest kid in the school was 5 years old. So I thought, oh my God, this isn't going to work. I'm going to have to make an agenda for those students, and so on. And so I got over there And I walk in and there's a kid screaming, "Mommy!" And, I'm thinking, oh boy, what am I going to do? And then eventually the kids get around in a circle around a table. And so I said, well, okay, we're going to talk to you today about how to do the democratic process. And I said, there are two basic reasons to have meetings. One of them, if you have an idea of something that's good for your school. Another is if you have an idea of something that's a problem in your school. All the hands shot up.
These are 5-year-olds. Or the oldest was 5, you said.
3, 4, 5, yeah. And one 4-year-old put on the agenda chocolate. She thought that she'd heard that there was something in chocolate that was kind of like caffeine, and that people probably shouldn't be eating chocolate in the afternoon. They should kind of keep it to the morning. And that was discussed. She was 4. And this was discussed and was passed that, just for the morning. And then another kid, also 4, brought up the idea that he'd noticed that people who were sick were going outside and thought this was probably not a great idea. And so they discussed it. In the end, they passed a thing saying that if you had a cold, you couldn't go out in the cold. And so the point is that we don't realize those students, the younger they are, really, the more they have their natural power, the more they think they should have power to make decisions.
Yeah.
And we've just forgotten.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful because I always like to think of it as, the older you get, the more programs you have. And, children, because they haven't, being younger, they've only had those few years where people have, here, do this, do that. But at the older we get, like you said, for myself, I have to constantly say, ooh, wait, I have a lot of people who always come back at me. There should be meditation in schools. And my response to that is, if the kids want it, I remember when I was sitting here and, I homeschooled my kids and I was like, hey, you guys want to meditate with me? And that lasted, like a few minutes, and let's do yoga. And that lasted a few minutes. Okay. I realized quickly that that's just not something they were into.
I think we continuously underestimate the abilities of children, even though we all know better.
Yeah.
An extreme example of this is a family that I was working with in Virginia that was related to a family that lived in my house. And they have a very handicapped son who at age of 4 still can't crawl and only can say maybe 20 words. And yet he understands, and I knew it right away, that he's smart.
Yep.
And he understands that I realized that he was smart.
Yeah.
And that he could understand everything that people were saying, even though he couldn't communicate well with people. And for example, when I would talk to his parents, he could hear my voice on the phone. He would scream until they would put him on FaceTime with me.
Wow.
I would just talk to him about whatever, was happening, and I knew he was understanding it. And so I don't know that his family quite got it until one particular instance. The father had given him a little mini computer and that he played with. And one day I got a phone call from the family. And I listened to the message. And the message was just a lot of sounds. And it called 3 times. Well, it turns out what he did is he found a way to access his father's computer. He's 4.
Right.
Found out a way to access his father's computer with his mini computer, which has a list of 500 names on it, alphabetically. And he found my name and called me.
Wow.
3 times. case
I
it
love it.
was an accident. And his father, I thought, well, maybe it was the most recent one called. And so his father knew that wasn't the case, and he was just dumbfounded.
Yeah. Well, and understanding, so, okay, more a little bit my background. I used to do assistive technology for the state here as a trainer. And I work, one of my best friends actually is in Manhattan there. She has her doctorate in reading and profound, severe special needs kids. And I will just share one of the stories. When I was going into special ed, I met this mom, and this was her aha moment. Her son was, you'd consider it severely autistic, right? And this was her experience. She said, I figured it out one day, all these years, sending him on the bus, right? Sending him into these special need classes. She said, I figured it out one day. She goes, I don't know what was inside of me, but she decided to watch her son. And every day he'd go in the backyard and he'd look at, there's posts that hold the fence, correct? And he would start at the beginning of the first post and look at it and look straight down the fence. And he did this every day. And for some reason, something said to her, what is he looking at? And instead of having the thought, she decided to go outside, look exactly where he was looking, and observed it and looked at it. And in her mind, she said, that's really cool. So there was something inside of her that shifted, that changed her perception. It changed the way she viewed her son.
Did you ever ask him what he was doing?
Yeah, there was no asking. She just was like, it was like she made this connection. It was like he was teaching her something she didn't know about. And this perception of autism, not knowing less than, all of a sudden drifted away. And she still, and I'll never forget that story. It was right when I was going into special ed, and that always stuck with me. And when I did special needs preschool, et cetera, we had a lot of nonverbal kids. And what I realized in this idea of democratic free learning, if you give them the free, we have a lot of speech paths, et cetera, saying, well, they're not talking these many words, et cetera. And my degree originally is in deaf ed. And when I would allow my hand and say, show me, and they would take you, and the world, like everything was right there. They might not have the words or a way of communication that we might, but their world and what they want to share, and the smile and the connection, it's just like you said. And these are 4-year-olds that everyone is saying, no, they can't do this, they can't do that, or they're labeled. And yet, just by having a free atmosphere, they're communing so much more than we can expect. So I love the whole, I always say that's a whole podcast I would love to do, is just talk about the special ed world. Okay, so in all your experiences, what do you think, even in this idea of paradigms, you have witnessed some great, I don't know if we want to call them victories, I don't know, experiences. And I'm sure you have so many. What do you think? Oh, love it. Look at the smile.
So you can tell he knows what's going on.
I love it. Well, that's definitely one of your greatest experiences. As far as a school starter, though, what do you think is something that was memorable in all these wonderful years of being a school starter?
Are you kidding? Well, I remember a lot of stuff from the beginning when we were helping start what became Brooklyn Free School.
Yeah.
And we would have, at first we had we hosted the International Democratic Education Conference that year for the first time in the United States. That was 2003. And the IDEC started in 1993 and still goes on every year. And the interesting thing is it's not an organization, deliberately not. So it's organized by each school separately every year. And last year it was organized by Summerhill because they were celebrating their 100th anniversary.
Wow.
Cool. And so we were hosting the IDEC in 2003, and we came back from there to New York and said, why aren't there any Democratic schools in New York City? So we started having meetings every other week or so at somebody's apartment. And I would tell people they should bring their students, and they would, but like they would not be very involved with the adults. And one day I said, I don't know if you realize you brought 3 6-year-olds here today. That's nice, but I don't know if you realize they have opinions about what the school should be like. They know what we're doing.
Wow.
And so we brought those 3 kids in, and they each had opinions, but one that stuck with me is one 6-year-old said, it's very important that the school not have a lot of new furniture, that it not be all clean, because then you can't play around and have fun and so on, and everyone's protecting the furniture and so on. Well, only a 6-year-old would have thought of this.
Yeah.
No adult was going to think of that.
I love it. Now, what would you say, what has been one of your biggest struggles, obstacles that you came across and somehow you got through it, or maybe not? Like, what can you share about that?
Well, I think with the school starters courses, a lot of people have this fantasy that they're going to start some kind of alternative, but they have a really hard time translating it from that to something in reality, from words into action. And I'm not, it's frustrating to me that usually the majority are not able to do that. On the other hand, if you have 25 people and 10 of them start new schools, that's a nice thing. It's good. And of course, some people are going to discover that they probably don't have what it takes to do, or they're not willing to make that commitment. But it's always frustrating to me that I can't figure out a way to help them bridge that gap.
I can understand that, because I think for somebody who's always had the thought of, oh, well, I'll start a school, I always feel like there's, in this idea, I've had my own business since 2000, and, as a contract special ed teacher, and I've done many other things that I've starting a podcast, etc. And it's interesting. I mean, to me, I always think it's, okay, and this idea of learning, because I have 2 different, my own children. I have one who's more the autodidactic, he was not in public school, I think a couple years. My other son was in a school longer, and before I homeschooled him. And he actually prefers to be in front of professors now. He's in college, etc. He goes, I prefer that. It's the way I learn. He even likes the in-person versus the virtual anytime. And as I looked, because I just found that myself, like, what stops me? I asked myself, what is it? And I say for myself, that if somebody can like show me even the step by step, like if I can have somebody just sit with me and we're going to all do a class, it's like a pottery painting class where they exactly show you how to, like, that's me. And is it because I was in compulsory ed myself, my whole life, possibly. And I prefer the hands-on. And so I always think that's something that stops me from moving forward to doing. But here's the irony, is when it came to the podcast, I didn't do any of that. I just said, my other son, the self-directed learner, says, oh, here, Mom, I'll just give you a microphone. And here, we're going to do this, and this, and just talk. You'll be fine. Mm-hmm. And I went, oh, okay. So it's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, I just had somebody approach me last night going, hey, what do you think about a collaboration, about starting a center or school? And I guess so. I feel like I'm starting things, and it's always the question asking myself, what stops me? So that's good. That's a good one, Jerry. I would be, once you find that out, reach out and I'll definitely be in there. whatever that looks like. If you could offer advice to whether it's a founder, a parent, maybe even a student who's sitting there going, maybe they're in college, I don't know, going into education, or they're asking themselves, what am I doing here? What would you say is your best advice as far as, I don't know, self-directed learning, or I don't know?
Well, it's a hard question because how you would change an existing system, I don't think that I personally have come to the conclusion that we're willing to help people who are trying to do that, but it's not going to happen. The system is just much too good at keeping itself in its current shape for various reasons. But there's obviously reasons why that happens.
Yeah.
And so for a student to be able to do that, that's hard. I did come across a student who is lately involved with Arrow, who is very interested in aspects of that and has actually gotten the interest of his school and even a local library to start that process. So, some kids, some students have the ability to do that, to feel like they can go ahead and start things and organizing them. And that's great, but it's very hard, I think, for most of them, and probably impossible for them to actually try to change their system.
Yeah. Well, it's just kind of like here we're in a situation, right, of a pandemic. And I know a lot of people, even the questions of the healthcare system, and something happens, pandemic happens, even this virtual, now everybody's become virtual. And I think you guys just posted the other day on Instagram on the increase of homeschoolers, right?
Well, yeah, homeschooling has increased a lot. Our website is educationrevolution.org. And in a sense, the education revolution has just happened.
Yeah.
It happened accidentally.
Yep.
In the sense that now there's a couple of billion people around the world who all of a sudden realized that they didn't necessarily have to send their child to the local assigned public school.
Yep.
And so we don't know where that's going to go, but I don't think there's going to be any going back. That when push comes to shove and somebody runs up into something, they're going to say, okay, so we're going to do something different. Whereas, oh, you just have to put up with it. It's going to be that's a big change, but it's going to be slower than I thought. I thought it might be faster, but it's happening.
It's happening.
And one example you're talking about is the increase in the number of homeschoolers. What's really interesting is, and actually this was some research that Peter Gray has done, a lot of homeschoolers of color that they increased in numbers tremendously. And I always wondered over the years, why aren't there more and more? Because they can just walk away from the racism in their schools. And now they have realized they can.
Yeah, wow.
So that is it's the percentage of people of color homeschooling has just skyrocketed. And so that's another change is taking place. How long this is going to take? Well, listen, we always have such a limited idea of time. We think a lifetime is a long time, but it's a blip.
Yep.
Yes.
And
so how long it will take for these changes to take place, I don't know, but I think they will happen.
I agree. And I think what's most prolific, it isn't just, the pandemic just didn't hit the United States, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it was global. Therefore, it affected these ideas of compulsory education. Schools, we'll just say schools. And people had to make some hard decisions, and still are.
Yeah.
And then the teachers. Now we have teachers leaving going, I don't, there's been the question, I know here in Arizona, they can't find teachers.
Well, that's it. I wonder if there are some teachers who just gave up on changing the system and just decided to quit it. And a lot of them are saying, okay, let's start a school, but it's not necessarily that easy to do.
That's correct.
And the thing is, they won't make as much money
Yeah.
As they were being a regular public school system. See, a lot of this boils down to money, I think. A lot of
Agreed.
it comes down to money. The system is dependent on keeping going the way it is, people getting paid relatively well. And so, for example, I think these myths have been created in that process of learning loss. Well, these kids actually became more independent learners over this period of time. And so learning loss was something that was invented to try to scare people into sending their kids back to regular schools, I think.
I agree completely. It is. I always say that we have this theory that, right, you're born empty and then we've got to fill you up, right?
Yeah.
We got to.
If there's so much learning loss, why is it that every time research has been done, homeschoolers come out way ahead of the norm?
Exactly. Where's
that learning loss?
Absolutely. I always like to end here. What would you recommend as far as maybe one or two must-read books that you think could help parents, students, teachers?
Well, some of the books that we give the people in our School Starters course, we give them my book, School's Over. And then we'll give them Chris's book, How to Grow a School, Chris Micagliano. And then another one that's interesting is a book that we put out called Turning Points, where about 35 important people in educational alternatives talk about what the turning points were in their lives. And I'll give you an example of one of them that is interesting. You know who John Gatto was?
Yes.
So John Gatto was a regular public school teacher who began to realize the damage that his school was doing. So he did everything he could to get his children out into the community. And they learned so much in that process that he was named twice Teacher of the Year. But they didn't know how he was doing it. He was doing them by getting them out of school.
Right.
But anyway, so John did a chapter in this book, Turning Points. And in it, he talked about when he was going to a Catholic school, and they had a visiting priest come in, and he was a monk, or I forgot what they call it, but anyway, brother. And so he came in and he lectured the students in his class. He was about 8 or 9 years old. So about the causes of World War II. And so when he was done, he said, no, so who can tell me what the causes were of World War II? John raises his hand, I can, brother. So he called on him and he recited basically what he'd just been told. And the brother said to Gatto, Mr. Gatto, I don't know what's to become of you. I lied to you. Those are not the causes of World War II. If you just keep on believing all the things that people tell you, you're never going to go anywhere.
Wow.
That was a turning point for him.
Yeah. Wow. That's profound. I didn't know that one. That's a pretty good story. Wow. I like that. It's a good way to end, and too, as far as advice. Jerry, thank you so much. Oh, how can people get a hold of you?
Well, I mean, they can write to me from our website. And as I said, that's educationrevolution.org. And there are phone numbers and email addresses and so on that they can use if they go there.
Thank you. So that is our podcast. Thank you, Jerry, so much for coming on. I truly, truly appreciate it. And what I will do is I will also put all of Jerry's information on my website. That's tracybrooker.com. So you can listen to this podcast as much as you want, but I highly encourage you to visit their website. It was a game changer for me as when it came to just education, homeschooling, etc. So thank you, Jerry, for meeting with me. And yeah, thanks. All right, we'll talk to everyone soon. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Creative Outcomes podcast. And if you'd like to learn more, go to my website at tracybrooker.com.